There are moments that you can see it, that Los Angeles had a history. You can sometimes glimpse it in the edges, the tops of buildings, street names, and its commemorations. All of this is easy to forget. We miss its traces and forget its past as we go about our days. Los Angeles has been thought of by many to be a city of the future. In the words of preeminent Angelino author Octavia Butler, Los Angeles forms and shatters, forms and shatters. It is hard to imagine Los Angeles's dusty origins, a settlement with newcomers, bringing with them all of the problems that they faced, that the country faced in the 19th century. As we continue to be wrapped in the forward march of time, what history is remembered, whose stories are seen, and through it all, how much have we progressed?
Robert William Stewart was born a slave in Kentucky in 1850. He worked his way across the United States, and in 1889 was appointed one of the first 2 African-American police officers in Los Angeles. Since I seemed to be the only one who knew about it, I couldn't leave it undone. I almost felt like I owed it to Stewart to get his story told.
Yeah, Officer Robert William Stewart is a story in a way of the American dream. Somebody went from the bottom, only the bottom of the bottom, because slavery, we're talking about someone who was chattel, was someone else's property. Black people had no rights that a white person had to respect at all. And so to go from that condition to a police officer in LA gives you a representational role and makes you a representative of that city.
When Los Angeles became an American city in 1850, the West was a rough place. Los Angeles had a high crime rate for its small but growing population. This new city needed a way to fight crime, and Los Angeles created a police department in 1869.
The early years, we were definitely a Wild West town. Our population was less than 4,000 people by the end of the 1860s, and it only took a force of 6 to 8 men to kind of keep an eye on things. And unfortunately, people also took the law into their own hands and settled a lot of their own disputes themselves, and the officers would come in and clean up whatever was left quite often. So the LAPD in its early days was very rough and tumble.
In 1850, the same year Los Angeles became a U.S. city, Robert William Stewart was born in Kentucky, which was at that time a slave state. Upon entering the world, Robert William Stewart was born into a closed system that discounted his existence and his potential. In the years after the Civil War, with the passage of the 13th Amendment, African Americans were finally identified as free individuals. However, especially in the South, new laws did not necessarily create new opportunities. After enduring many years laboring in Kentucky and then Indiana, Stewart, in 1886, set forth on a path for a new life in the great American West. Many years later, this path would be part of the Great Migration of African Americans from the South, but at this moment, only a few had begun to make that journey.
Before and even during and after the Civil War, Southern California had a lot of Southern sympathizers. And as a result of that, there were going to be tensions between the local Caucasian population, and once the first waves of people of color started to come into the city from other areas, then there were certainly going to be some tensions there. Life was difficult in different ways in California than, say, it would have been in the Jim Crow South. California, we came into the Union as a free state, and so that meant that our state constitution did not recognize slavery, did not recognize people as enslaved. However, that did not mean that this was going to be a paradise for non-white citizens. Quite the opposite. What it meant was that the government could not discriminate, but that did not stop private parties, whether they were private property owners, landlords, shopkeepers, banks, any number of industries could and did practice all forms of discrimination. So the people of color who did come here, they learned to basically live among their own group. And so you had a series of what we would recognize as ethnic enclaves in the city of Los Angeles. It was hard for anyone of color to move up if they didn't already have a certain amount of assets when they first got here.
So I think that really speaks to the type of man and Stewart was. He was born enslaved. He was born enslaved in Kentucky, and he came to Los Angeles, and then he becomes the first black officer to enforce the laws of the state of California and the city of LA. And that part just blows my mind when I think about it. The disadvantages that he had to overcome to do that. But it also speaks to, the great migration of African Americans out of the South looking for a better life. And he was able to achieve that. There was nothing in place to help Black people at that time. And I think it was a great attraction for those that were able to get here. They were able to do exceedingly more than they were capable of doing in other places.
Stewart had been part of African American political organizations in his life before California, and became active once again when he arrived in Los Angeles. The intersection of changing political power structures, as well as Stewart's previous participation in political organizations, resulted in his appointment as one of 2 African American officers to the Los Angeles Police Department in 1889.
There was an organization that was known in the parlance of the day as the Colored Republican Club. And because the African American vote was such a large factor in the Republican sweep in the municipal elections of 1889, they wanted to get more than just janitor positions, which is all they'd ever gotten before. And they wanted men on the police force. And the Black community put forward Robert Stewart as one of the best candidates for the position, given his background and the kind of person that he was.
Stewart came on at a time that nobody ever thought an African American would be a police officer. So we talk about somebody that is like a Jackie Robinson. He would be the Jackie Robinson for law enforcement.
How does a place measure its progress? Officer Stewart was not the first Black officer in the country. Other cities, such as New Orleans and Philadelphia, were slowly adding individual African American officers to their ranks. This period, noted by African American police historian W. Marvin Delaney, was one of police tokenism, single appointments of individuals, mostly as a symbolic gesture. However, in Los Angeles, with a small but growing African American population, Stewart's appointment seemed like a glimmer of a new future.
By entering law enforcement, he was entering a profession that up until that point had excluded people who looked like him, right? Was all white. And what it meant was that his caste, you can look at a lot of racism in America as a caste system. That's been pointed out. Well, he was able to leap from one caste to another by becoming a member of law enforcement, because he was able to say, I'm now becoming a member of a profession that was once all white, has been associated with whiteness, but now I'm able to partake of some of the dignity that comes with it, the respect that comes with it, that now comes to me, right, as well. And that's very meaningful, right? That's kind of a breakthrough. And it means that people have to start to look at law enforcement differently. They can't look at law enforcement as only having a white face. And that was a major breakthrough.
He was very well decorated and very well known And it appeared that he was very much respected in the city for his diligence and his competence and capability. He served in the department approximately about 10 years, where an encounter with a teenage white girl, ended his career on the LAPD as an officer. A young white girl has an interaction with him while he's on his beat. He comes across her late in the evening. I believe there was a curfew at that time for young people. I think he inquired of her about being out at that time of night, and that was pretty much it. That was his only conversation with her. She then fabricates later, we don't know really why, but she fabricates the story that, he raped her.
Quickly, Officer Stewart was removed from his job and sat in a jail cell for months awaiting his trial.
I mean, it was easy to stereotype black men that way. And I mean, obviously in that era, when you have an Officer Stewart, any kind of charge that even remotely touches on or allegation, sex, you're off to the races with that as a black man. He must have done it because we all know they're sexual animals anyway. So he was a victim in many ways, not only of racism in that period, but also the sexual stereotyping of African American men. So he had two strikes against him. That's a tough one to get around.
Stewart was dismissed from the police department based on the testimony at his preliminary hearing. He was not given any chance to present any defense to the police commission, and his legal defense at that point was not to call any witnesses. So the police commission acted in a way that today obviously would not happen.
Well, you can't have a clear example of what what's the kind of boogeyman in the culture wars right now, critical race theory. You can't have a clear example of one of its basic premises in this case, right? The idea that you have a facially neutral law that says that every person who's an officer is entitled to a hearing. That's what it says on its face. And yet in application, as applied to a black person, it doesn't get the same result that it would have had it been applied to a white officer.
His first trial concluded with a hung jury. His second trial, after going to jury, acquitted him in 40 minutes. However, this did not mean that everything was returned to how it was before. Stewart was never given his police position back by the police commission. He lived out the rest of his years as a laborer and janitor.
The irony is that, he comes to California and something that is typical that happened in the South happened to him here. So, it speaks to, it really doesn't matter whether it's north, south, east, or west. If you're black, this is something that can happen to you, and there's very little recourse. I think by virtue of this happening in LA as opposed to the South, he survived it, because I do believe that had this happened in the South, he would have just been lynched. There would have been no trial. There would have been no, redress whatsoever. There would not have been any due process. The mere allegation alone would have cost him his life.
Here is where his story ended for over 100 years. An unfinished side note in what was to become a long and complicated history of race, police, and community, a dynamic mirrored across the U.S. Compared to many places around the world, Los Angeles is a new city. Even so, in those brief years, it has developed a history that is significant and complicated. How do we learn about the history of a place and the people that have lived there? Through thick textbooks and classes in school? Through personal quests and ancestral searches? If with every moment there is more history being created, how do we find our way through it all?
When we started examining our history in 2019, one of our police commissioners really began asking and prompting us on what were the historical moments that have shaped both the community and the LAPD. We started digging into that deeper and really decided that we would look at history as a learning opportunity for our department. One of our core values is quality through continuous improvement. And looking at our history, I don't see how we don't look at our history to look at where we're going next. I think any one of us, we are all born into a certain narrative, into a certain place and time in history. And sometimes you only see things more clearly when you look back from a distance.
When you come to the museum, there's a lot of exhibits here, and we have a timeline towards the back of the museum of the history of LAPD. And in the timeline, you have a few pictures, small pictures of Robert Stewart. And that piqued my interest. And I said, well, who is this person? And so I think he was marginalized in our history. And even though we have a small picture of him, but when you look into his story, it's bigger than life, and it's such an inspiration to everyone. So I decided that this is something that needs to be brought out, and so it became my mission as chairman of the Police Museum to rectify some of the issues that occurred to him.
I would not want to try to catalog the number of hours I've spent researching this. It'd be kind of embarrassing and shocking, probably. I contacted the LA Sentinel. I contacted the heads of African American Studies programs at different colleges around the area and got no response from anybody. Finally, I contacted the LA Police Museum, and Bob Taylor, I believe the time was involved in the museum, he took the chance on this crazy civilian who was saying, hey, your history's wrong, and he printed my story in the hot sheet. So that's how I believe Chief Moore first learned about it.
In 2017, over 100 years after his dismissal from the Los Angeles Police Department, the story of Officer Stewart had finally found new eyes and a new lens of understanding from a society that could differently perceive the circumstances of his history.
So when I think of Robert William Stewart, how does his story get buried? And here we are in 2021 trying to make it right. Mike Davison took it as far as he could, but I do believe that it was incumbent upon me as a part of his lineage as a Black person. I had an obligation to correct it from that perspective. And Mike can only correct it so far from that. And I think with my connection to LAPD, still knowing Mike more and being able to have a conversation, I knew what he would say. And he said, JT, you're right. We will fix this.
When we were telling our story during that 150th year, this story kept coming up over and over again, as well as other instances. And it's like, well, what do we do to try to right the record on that? Well, we had a historian and as well as members of the organization that stepped forward and brought the story to life. And our research, validated it and legitimized that it wasn't just folklore, that this was Robert Stewart came to this organization, that he was the first African-American, first Black man to be a patrol officer, that he lived a life of integrity, that he had a family here and was well respected, and that this terrible incident happened, and really the stereotypes and the prejudice and the biases at the time resulted in him losing his job and essentially changing the course of his life, that he would later act as a laborer and die in his early 80s, never having his name and the prestige and the honor of being a police officer restored. And it just had that story of that was wrong, and is an organization that talks about our values and how we value our people. This was an instance where it looked to me as certainly befitting that we would look back at that and bring this forward and do what we could to recognize and own the acknowledgement of our shortfall. That in doing that, that's the first gesture of reconciliation.
Historiography is the study of how history is written, analyzed, changed, and crafted again. At the heart of this idea is the concept that history is not absolute or finite. but an evolving text influenced by those dedicated to providing a clearer understanding of what has gone before. Now, with the attention of the Los Angeles Police Department, the history of Officer Stewart was experiencing its own reanalysis and revision. The Los Angeles Police Commission had become involved in historiography.
I can't speak for others as they make these decisions, but as I say, it's very difficult for me as a commissioner to go forward into the future untethered from the past. When I learned and read about not only the contributions of Officer Stewart, but all what he would have endured as the first African-American police officer. And that influences how you think about some of the concerns you hear expressed today with officers of color, including concerns about what the future looks like as the population continues to change and demographics change. People, I think, are just now becoming aware of how increasingly important it is to make sure that an institution like LAPD continues to reflect the dynamic city that it serves. Reinstatement in and of itself for him doesn't have a lot of legal meaning, that he didn't get a lot of back pay and things of that nature, but it has a lot of symbolic meaning and importance to officers who are serving today. The idea of officers being concerned about the fairness and how they will be treated. And I think they can take some small measure of comfort that those who are involved in the decision-making process have enough commitment to ensuring a level of fairness and equity to not only achieve that in the decision we're making now, but to also look back for opportunities to correct things that may not have been done properly the first time.
In 2021, Officer Robert William Stewart was officially reinstated to the Los Angeles Police Department and honorably retired from his position as an officer.
I'd like to move that we approve the department's report and reinstate and retire former policeman Robert William Stewart.
All in favor, please say aye.
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 All opposed. It passes 5-0.
It was so important because getting the reinstatement was a victory in the sense that we were right. There was an injustice, a gross injustice, and it may have taken decades, not years, decades to right that wrong, but nonetheless, a wrong was righted.
It could be viewed as hollow symbolism, right? And sometimes there are performative displays that are done more for political gain than anything else. But I think this is more than that. I think it was important to recognize the historical reality of the department's own complicity in racial oppression and say we are trying to move beyond that. We're trying to transcend it, but you can't move beyond without acknowledging.
The important thing is the past, we got it wrong. With the present, let's get it right. And going forward to the future, let's make sure it doesn't happen again.
As Los Angeles re-examines its past, the country too has begun a journey into its histories. This acknowledgement of the complexity of the past begins to change the understanding of accepted truths. Re-evaluation allows for new directions in society's collective progress.
I'm old enough to remember going back in time when the LAPD was always looked upon as an occupying army within the African American community, almost exclusively white at the top, kind of a Southern mentality, a brutal mentality. But in recent times, obviously there's been a lot of change from women, Hispanics, African Americans, LGBT, both top to bottom. Big emphasis has been put on community relations, reaching out, having a partnership with the community. So, I mean, those are changes that I think that are very measurable and I think actually are very noteworthy.
None of us are perfect and organizations do make mistakes. What's important is what happens when they find and discover that they've made that mistake. And I think that shows, again, the building of trust and the reliance. No one expects us to be perfect, but they do look to us that when we fall short, are we willing to acknowledge it? And if we are, I think they're willing to invest in us more. And that's certainly the goal of this, is to build trust within this organization internally as we build trust with our community.
Officer Stewart set a path forward towards a more representational Los Angeles Police Department, one that has been journeyed down by many others during its 152-year history. The path has not always been smooth, but now Angelenos benefit from the history of hard work and sacrifice of those trailblazing officers.
There's no denying that if Robert William Stewart hadn't opened that door, me and legions of other black officers, including one who would become the mayor of this city, Tom Bradley started his career at the Los Angeles Police Department. That gave him his foundation for public service, and then he went on to become mayor. If it wasn't for Robert William Stewart's success in that position for 10 years and proving that a black man could do this job, I wouldn't be here. He was the first. He opened the door. So every single black officer on the Los Angeles Police Department that has ever been owes him a debt of gratitude.
I think there was a time in LAPD training and even in the culture of our department that kind of encouraged you to leave your differences at home and become police, become LAPD or Blue. And what we've seen over the years is that we only benefit when people bring their diversity to the department. It helps us to evolve. It helps us to better serve our communities. It helps us to better understand each other. We are always working with human beings, and usually human beings in conflict or crisis. When I see new recruits coming into the academy right now, they really welcome and embrace looking at our history. So we feel like it's important to own the history that we've had, good, bad, difficult, challenging. I don't think our officers or our community benefit when we don't learn how to talk about the difficult issues and really listen to each other. I see that as a challenge across America right now, really listening to each other. But it really is the only way to move forward.
What is a person's last monument? Their headstone, marking the simplest facts of their existence? Or is it their history, remembered, discussed, and honored?
It's obvious Stewart got a raw deal, and there's not much you can do for someone who's been dead for 90 years, but at least you can rehabilitate his reputation to the extent that is possible, and the police department is trying to do that.
There's a Martin Luther King Jr. once said that the moral arc of the universe is long, but it's bent towards justice. I think this proves that the arc, while long, it is bent towards justice, and this was an opportunity to give justice to this man. That, to me, is what I'm always encouraged as just Michael Moore, as just an Angeleno, is that right prevails, and it may take time, and it may be long after, someone's gone, but there's that truth eventually comes out and is known, and that encourages my heart.
For Officer Robert William Stewart, his legacy is larger than words etched in stone. He has left a path for fairness and honesty in how Los Angeles reflects on its history as the city proceeds into the future.